Georgia Garner stepped off the stagecoach in Abilene, Kansas, in the spring of 1873, carrying a carpetbag that belonged to a dead woman and a name that wasn't entirely her own. The town smelled of dust and cattle and something wild underneath it all, the kind of smell that told a person they were a long way from wherever they'd started. Georgia stood on the unpainted boards of the stage depot platform and looked out at the main street with its saloons and general stores, and the distant shimmer of open prairie stretching all the way to where the sky came down and touched the earth. And she told herself she was not afraid. She had been many things in her 23 years, but afraid was not one she intended to be today. She reached into the carpetbag and felt for the folded letter tucked beneath the spare dress she'd packed in a hurry back in St. Louis. The letter was addressed to one Clara Whittaker, and Clara Whittaker was the name Georgia had been using since she'd boarded that stagecoach 4 days ago, and prayed nobody along the route had ever met the actual Clara Whittaker, who had died of a fever in the rooming house on Decatur Street before Georgia could figure out another plan. It had not been a proud moment, borrowing that name. Georgia Garner had never been dishonest by nature, but nature has a way of bending under enough pressure, and the pressure that had come down on Georgia's shoulders in St. Louis had been the kind that crushed lesser women entirely. She had survived it. She had borrowed a name and a letter of introduction, and climbed onto a stagecoach heading west, and she had told herself she would explain everything when the time was right. The trouble was she had no idea when that would be. The letter in her bag was an employment offer from a rancher named Elijah Whittaker, who was looking for a housekeeper for his cattle operation outside Abilene. The name Whittaker was a coincidence that had seemed almost like fate when Georgia had first read the letter in Clara's room, before the woman had slipped away quiet in the night. Clara had answered an advertisement in the St. Louis paper and had received the offer back, but Clara would never use it now, and Georgia had needed somewhere to go so badly that the coincidence had felt less like theft and more like the hand of Providence, which she acknowledged was a generous interpretation, but one she was choosing to keep. The stage driver dropped her bag onto the platform and tipped his hat without much ceremony, and the horses stamped and blew, and the stage rolled on toward its next stop, and Georgia was alone in Abilene with a borrowed name and a letter, and no more plan than that. A man was waiting near the hitching post at the edge of the depot, leaning against the post with the particular ease of someone who spent most of his time outdoors and had learned that standing still was its own kind of work. He was tall, somewhere in his late 20s, with dark hair and the kind of weathered look that the Kansas sun put on a man after enough years. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a battered hat that had seen better decades, and when Georgia stepped down from the platform he pushed off from the post and looked at her with dark brown eyes that were sharp and not unkind. "Clara Whittaker," he said. Georgia's stomach pulled tight the way it always did when she heard the name that wasn't hers. She nodded once and said, "Yes, I am she." He reached up and touched the brim of his hat. "Elijah Whittaker. I run the double W out past the Smoky Hill. Glad you made it safely. The roads have been rough with all the spring rain." His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who did not waste words, but there was something in it that was not harsh. Georgia looked at him properly for the first time and found him looking back at her with the same direct attention, and she told herself that directness was exactly what she had to avoid for as long as possible. "Thank you for meeting me yourself," she said. "I wasn't certain what arrangements you'd made." "I don't send others to do what I can do myself," he said simply. He reached for her carpetbag before she could protest and hoisted it like it weighed nothing. "Wagons around the corner. It'll be an hour's ride out to the ranch. You eat anything today?" "Not since this morning." He nodded like that settled something. "We'll stop at the general store. Mrs. Holt keeps decent food and won't overcharge you for it." It was such a practical and considerate thing to say that Georgia found herself slightly off balance, which was not the condition she needed to be in when she was carrying a lie this significant. She followed him around the side of the depot to where a sturdy wagon was hitched with two solid-looking bay horses, and she climbed up onto the bench and tried to arrange herself and her conscience into something manageable. The town moved around them as Elijah guided the wagon down the main street. Cowboys on horseback and cattle buyers in suits and townswomen in bonnets going about the business of a Wednesday afternoon in a Kansas cattle town. Georgia looked at everything with the wide, careful attention of a person who knew that details mattered, who had learned that knowing the shape of a place could sometimes save you from it. She had grown up in Cincinnati, the daughter of a printer who believed in education and had taught her accordingly. She had taught school herself for 3 years in Ohio before the school board had decided they needed a man for the position, and had dismissed her with polite regret and no real apology. She had gone to St. Louis looking for work, and had found herself in a city that was perfectly happy to employ women in ways she had not wanted to be employed, and she had been navigating around that for 8 months before Clara Whittaker had answered an advertisement in the paper and Georgia had found herself reading it over the dying woman's shoulder, and understanding that west was the only direction left. She did not intend to tell any of that to Elijah Whittaker yet. She needed to understand him first, understand this place, understand whether the truth would get her sent back on the next stagecoach or whether it might possibly be something he could live with. He stopped at the general store and came back with a wrapped parcel that turned out to contain bread and dried beef and 2 apples, and he handed it to her without commentary, and Georgia ate it with genuine gratitude while the wagon rolled out of town and onto the open road that led toward the Smoky Hill River. The prairie in spring was something she had not been prepared for. She had seen descriptions of it in books, but books had not managed the scale of it. The way the sky went in every direction at once, and the grass moved in long rolling waves like a green-gold ocean, and the light came down slant and warm across everything, making even the ordinary look like something from a painting. She found herself forgetting to be afraid for stretches of minutes at a time, just watching the land go by. First time in Kansas? Elijah asked, and there was a note in the question that said he already knew the answer. It shows, does it? You keep looking at the sky like it surprised you. Georgia considered this. In the city, everything is close together. The sky is more of a suggestion. Out here, it's an argument. He looked at her then, a quick sideways look that she caught from the corner of her eye, and something in his expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite name. That's about right, he said. They rode in silence for a while after that, but it was not uncomfortable silence, which surprised Georgia, because silence with strangers was usually either awkward or suspicious, and this was neither. It was more like the silence of 2 people who were each content to think their own thoughts while sharing the same piece of road. The Double W came into view as the afternoon light started to angle westward, a collection of low buildings in a bend of the river with a good-sized barn and several corrals full of cattle. The house itself was a 2-story frame structure, plain but solid, with a wide porch across the front and a kitchen garden showing the green spikes of early vegetables along the south side. Georgia saw it and thought, despite everything, that it looked like a place where things could grow. A ranch hand came out of the barn as they pulled up, a young man of about 20 with a cheerful freckled face and the kind of energy that suggested he'd been born at a gallop. He caught the horses' heads and grinned up at Georgia. "You made it then. I'm Pete Connolly. I work the cattle mostly. Elijah said we were getting a housekeeper and I said about time because the kitchen has been a genuine disaster area." "Pete," Elijah said with a tone that was not quite a warning but in the general neighborhood of one. "I'm just saying," Pete said, unrepentant. Georgia climbed down from the wagon with more grace than she felt. "Georgia," she stopped, caught herself. Felt the name she'd nearly said hanging in the air for half a second before she covered it. Clara Whittaker. It's good to meet you, Pete." Elijah had his back to her just then, lifting her bag from the wagon bed, and did not see the stumble. Pete's expression said he'd noticed something but wasn't sure what, and then he was distracted by the horses and the moment passed, and Georgia breathed again. The inside of the house was, as Pete had advertised, in a state of considerable neglect, not filth exactly, but the particular disorder of men who had been managing without and had developed their own systems for it, systems that involved a great deal of leaving things wherever they happened to land. The kitchen had cast-iron pans stacked on the floor because the shelf had broken and not been fixed, and the dining table held papers and leather straps and a coffee pot and 2 boots, none of which belonged there. Georgia looked at it and felt something settle in her, the particular satisfaction of a person who likes order when confronted with a genuine opportunity to create it. "I know it's not what you expected," Elijah said from behind her. She turned around. "I wasn't expecting anything specific. A working ranch always has work to do. How many men are on the property?" "Myself and Pete full-time. 2 others, Hector and Darnell, they come in for day work during calving season and roundup. The bunkhouse is separate. Your room is upstairs, second door." He showed her the room, which was small but had a window that faced east and a good solid bed frame and a washstand with an intact pitcher, and Georgia looked at it and thought that she had slept in worse places in St. Louis without the compensation of that view of the open prairie. "It suits me," she said. And then, because she felt she owed him at least one honest thing, "It suits me very well, thank you." He nodded and left her to settle in, and Georgia sat on the edge of the bed and held her own hands together in her lap and thought very seriously about what she was going to do. She could tell him tomorrow. She could sit him down after breakfast and explain that she was not Clara Whittaker, that Clara Whittaker was buried in St. Louis, that she was Georgia Garner from Cincinnati, and she needed work, and she would be the best housekeeper he'd ever had if he'd let her stay. She could do that. Or she could wait and let him see what she could do first, let him understand her value before he had to weigh it against the deception. And that was the option her practical mind kept drifting toward, even as her conscience pushed back against it. She unpacked her carpetbag and hung her spare dress on the hook behind the door and set her few possessions on the washstand. And then she went downstairs and lit the kitchen stove and found the sorry state of the larder and made the best supper she could manage with what was there, which turned out to be a reasonable bean soup and cornbread. And when Elijah and Pete came in from the evening work, they sat down to it and ate with genuine appreciation that required no words. "That's better than anything we've had in 6 weeks, Pete said, helping himself to a second piece of cornbread. "The advertisement said the housekeeper would also cook," Georgia said. "I wrote the advertisement," Elijah said, "and I was hoping it would be true." She looked at him across the table and he looked back, and that direct brown gaze was doing something she hadn't expected, which was making her feel seen in a way she usually worked hard to prevent, because being seen was complicated when you were carrying a name that wasn't yours. The first week at the Double W was a revelation in several directions. Georgia discovered that she loved the work. Not just tolerated it or managed it competently the way she had managed most things in her life, but genuinely loved it, the rhythm of the days, the satisfaction of bringing order out of chaos, the way the house began to breathe differently when it was clean and organized. She fixed the shelf, borrowing Pete's tools while he was out with the cattle, and got the kitchen pans back where they belonged. She scrubbed the floors and repaired the curtains that had come partially loose from their rods, and planted more seeds in the kitchen garden, and established a routine that the men seemed to find reassuring without knowing exactly why. She also discovered that Elijah Whittaker was not what she had been bracing herself for. She had expected a demanding employer who wanted meals on the table at exact times, and the house maintained to a military standard, because that had been the pattern with the 2 families she'd kept house for briefly in St. Louis. What she found instead was a man who said thank you every single time, who asked her opinion about the garden layout as if it mattered, who cleaned his own boots before coming inside without being asked, who was up before dawn and working until dark, but who somehow found time to be decent about it. She watched him with the cattle sometimes from the kitchen window, the way he moved among them with a confidence that was not aggressive, a patience that seemed to come from genuine understanding of the animals rather than from any desire to dominate them. She watched him with Pete, who was young and occasionally reckless, and who clearly looked up to Elijah with the particular devotion of a young man who has found someone worth following. Elijah managed Pete with a combination of patience and dry humor that kept the younger man from going too far off the rails without making him feel managed, which was a genuine skill. At mealtimes they talked, the three of them, about the ranch and the cattle market and the weather and the state of the roads and the gossip of the territory, and Georgia listened more than she spoke, but offered her observations when they added something. And she noticed that Elijah always listened when she spoke, actually listened, not in the manner of a man waiting for his turn, but in the manner of a man who thought what she said might matter. It was, she thought, the most dangerous environment she had ever been in because she was beginning to like it very much. On the 8th day, a rider came to the ranch. Georgia was in the kitchen garden when the horse came up the road, a dun-colored animal with a rider who sat him with the particular loose-hipped ease of a man who'd been in the saddle all his life. The rider was older, somewhere around 50, with a broad face under a wide hat and a lawman's badge catching the sunlight on his chest. Georgia stood up slowly from the garden bed and took off her gloves and tried to look like a woman who had absolutely no cause for concern. The rider reined up near the porch and called out, "Hello, the house," in the time-honored fashion, and Elijah came out from the barn and crossed the yard to meet him, and they spoke in voices Georgia couldn't quite catch from where she was. She went back to her weeding and kept her eyes on the carrots and tried not to appear to be listening with her entire body. After a few minutes, the rider tipped his hat and turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, and Elijah walked over to where Georgia was kneeling in the garden. "That was Marshal Teague from Abilene," he said. "He's looking for a woman who left St. Louis on a stagecoach about 2 weeks ago." Georgia's hands went very still in the dirt. "He didn't have much of a description," Elijah continued, and his voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. "Said she'd been involved in some trouble with a man named Forrest Crane, who's been causing problems in St. Louis." Forrest Crane. The name moved through Georgia like cold water. Forrest Crane was the reason she'd left St. Louis. Forrest Crane was a man who owned a boarding house and 3 saloons and had decided, when Georgia had refused his particular version of employment, that she was something he was owed, and he had sent men to make that point in ways that had made it very clear to Georgia that staying in St. Louis was not a survivable option. She looked up at Elijah. He was watching her with those dark eyes that didn't miss much, and she understood in that moment that the time she had been waiting for had arrived, whether she was ready for it or not. She took a breath and said, "My name isn't Clara Whittaker." The silence that followed was the longest she had experienced in recent memory. Elijah crouched down to her level, which was not what she'd expected, and looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. Her heart lurched. "You know, you called yourself Georgia the first evening when you stepped off the wagon. Just for a second before you caught it, I noticed. You didn't say anything. I was waiting to see who you were before I decided what that meant." Georgia sat back on her heels and looked at this man who had known for 8 days that she was carrying a false name and had fed her and given her a room and said thank you for the bean soup, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight so long she'd forgotten it was there. "My name is Georgia Garner," she said. "I'm from Cincinnati originally, more recently St. Louis. The real Clara Whittaker died of a fever before she could use your letter. I took it because I needed to leave St. Louis badly enough that I was not thinking clearly about the ethics of the situation, and I am sorry for the deception. I'm not sorry for being here because I am very glad to be here, which I understand is a complicated thing to say." Elijah was quiet for a moment. A crow called somewhere over the river, and the cattle moved in the far corral with a low shuffling sound, and the wind came across the prairie and moved Georgia's hair across her cheek, and she did not reach up to push it back because she was watching his face too carefully to move. "Forrest Crane," he said. What did he do? She told him. Not all of it, but enough. The boarding house, the job she'd taken as a cook and cleaner, the way Crane had begun to make it clear that he expected more than cooking and cleaning in return for lodging, the men he'd sent when she'd refused, the way she'd run through a back alley in the dark and spent 3 nights in a church basement, and then found herself reading Clara Whittaker's advertisement response, while the woman burned with fever beside her. And then Clara had been gone, and the letter had been there, and west had seemed like the only direction that might be far enough. Elijah listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished he stood up from his crouch and was quiet for another moment, looking out across the prairie, and Georgia braced herself for the speech about honesty and the necessity of sending her back and the impossibility of keeping a woman at his ranch under false pretenses. He said, "Is Georgia Garner your real name?" "Yes." "Then that's what I'll call you." She stared at him. "That's your entire response." He looked down at her, and there was something in his expression that was warm beneath the composed exterior, something that he was being careful with in the manner of a man who is aware he is on significant ground. "My response is that Forrest Crane has no business knowing where you are, and if Marshal Teague comes back with questions, I'll tell him I have a housekeeper named Georgia Garner and no Clara Whittaker has ever been here, both of which will be true, and you can stay as long as you want to stay." Georgia was not a woman who cried easily. Years of managing difficult circumstances had burned that particular reflex out of her, or so she had believed. She felt her eyes go bright in a way that mortified her slightly, and she looked quickly back at the carrot tops and said, "Thank you, Elijah." "Don't thank me," he said. "Just keep making that cornbread." He walked back toward the barn, and Georgia heard him say something to Pete, and Pete laughed, and the ordinary sounds of the afternoon continued around her, and she put her gloves back on and went back to the weeding and allowed herself, very quietly, to feel something approaching safe. The weeks that followed were ones Georgia would think back on later with a particular fondness, reserved for times that were beautiful partly because they were so ordinary. She learned the rhythms of the double W the way you learn the rhythms of a person, through proximity and attention. She learned that Elijah was up at 4:30 every morning without fail and had coffee made before he went to the barn, and that he left a cup for her on the stove without being asked after the second week. She learned that Pete sang while he worked, not well, but with great conviction. She learned that the cattle market news from Abilene came every Thursday, with the supply wagon that their neighbor Hector drove in from his property 2 miles east, and that Elijah read the market figures with the focused attention of a man who had learned the hard way that numbers matter. She learned that the double W had not always been a one-man operation. Elijah had come to Kansas from Virginia 6 years ago, in 1867, with his father and a plan, and his father had died 2 winters later, and Elijah had continued the plan alone because there was no other option he would accept. She learned this not from Elijah himself, who did not offer personal history in the way some men offered weather opinions, but from Pete, who had been with the ranch for 3 years and talked about its past with the comfortable familiarity of someone who felt at home there. "He built that barn himself," Pete told her one morning while she was hanging wash and he was mending a fence section nearby. "Just him and old Darnell and 2 other men who left after the first winter, spent 3 months on it. There's a whole room at the back you wouldn't even know was there because he finished the planking so tight." "He doesn't talk much about himself," Georgia observed. "He talks fine," Pete said. "He just talks about what matters. He's not much for stories about himself that don't lead somewhere useful." Georgia found herself turning that over in her mind through the rest of the day. There was something in Elijah's economy of personal disclosure that she recognized, the habit of a person who had learned that not everything shared is well received, who had perhaps grown careful about what he put out into the world because he understood the weight of having it handed back to you. She began to offer her own history in careful pieces, testing the ground. She told him about Cincinnati and her father's print shop, and the hours she'd spent as a child reading the type out loud while her father said it, learning the shape of words from the inside out. She told him about teaching school and the particular injustice of being dismissed for being a woman in a position that required intelligence, which she had plenty of, rather than a certain configuration of anatomy which she was apparently short of. She said this with a directness that she braced for him to find improper, but he only nodded and said that the board in question sounded like fools, which was exactly what she thought and not what she'd expected him to say. She told him about St. Louis in general terms, the parts that were simply the story of a woman navigating a city alone, and he listened the same way he always listened, with the complete attention that made her feel like what she said was worth the air it took to say it. What she didn't say, and what she was aware of not saying, was that she was beginning to feel things about Elijah Whittaker that were not in the scope of her employment, and were making her daily life considerably more complicated than she needed it to be. It was the small things that did it, as it always is with the real kind of love rather than the romantic novel kind. It was the way he always held the door even when his hands were full. It was the morning she'd cut her hand on a tin can edge and he'd come into the kitchen for something else, and had simply taken her hand without commentary, and wrapped it carefully with a strip of clean cloth from the supply cupboard, neither making a fuss of it nor dismissing it, and had held her hand in his for a moment after he'd finished, looking at the bandage, and then had set it down gently and said he'd check on it later, and he had. It was the evening in late April when a late spring storm came in fast across the prairie, the kind that the plains produce with no warning and no apology, with lightning that split the dark from horizon to horizon, and thunder that came in waves like artillery. Georgia had been alarmed, being new to Kansas storms, and had stood on the porch watching it come and trying not to show that her heart was hammering. Elijah had come to stand beside her without her hearing him approach, and he'd said, "It's impressive, but the barn is solid and the animals are in, and the house has stood through worse." And the calmness of him beside her in the dark had been more reassuring than anything he could have said, and the storm had moved through and left the prairie smelling of wet grass and wildflowers, and they had stood there together a little while after it passed without any particular reason to. Until Pete's lamp had appeared in the bunkhouse window, and the ordinary world had come back. In May, Hector and his wife Rosaria came out to the Double W for a Sunday supper, and Georgia cooked a proper meal that Rosaria declared the best she'd eaten outside her own kitchen, and the four of them sat on the porch afterward in the cooling evening, and Rosaria leaned toward Georgia and said quietly, "You are good for this place, you know. It needed a woman's steadiness." Georgia had looked across the porch to where Elijah was talking with Hector about something to do with the cattle market, and he had looked up at that exact moment and caught her looking, and she had felt the color come into her face, which she had not felt since she was considerably younger, and had looked back at Rosaria with what she hoped was an unreadable expression. Rosaria, who was 42 and had been married for 20 years and had raised 4 children on the prairie, was completely readable as to what she saw in George's face, and she smiled into her coffee cup with the satisfied expression of a woman who knows something. It was Darnell who forced things, not out of malice but out of the ordinary accident of timing. Darnell was a tall and quietly dignified man who had come to Kansas after the war and had been working cattle for 12 years and knew the land and the animals with a depth of knowledge that even Elijah respected. He came in for day work twice a week through May and June, and on one of those June days he came to the back door with a question about the supply list and caught Georgia at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts spread around her. She had found the accounts in a disordered state 3 weeks ago and had, with Elijah's permission, offered to organize them. She had a good head for figures, her father having taught her practical arithmetic along with everything else, and she had taken the ledgers apart and reconstructed them in proper order, and found 2 errors in Elijah's favor and 1 significant error against him, a payment for cattle that had been recorded twice, and appeared to balance wrong in a way that had been costing him money on the tax calculation. Darnell looked at the spread of papers and said, "You found the cattle payment problem." Georgia looked up at him. "You knew about it?" "I noticed it 2 winters ago. Told Eli about it, but neither of us could find where the double entry was." He looked at the ledgers with something that might have been relief. "You're clever with numbers." "My father was a printer. Numbers and letters came together." Darnell sat down across from her without being invited, which she found she didn't mind, and studied the reorganized ledger. "Clara Whittaker," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was too careful to be casual. Georgia set down her pen. "You know," she said. "I heard Abilene gossip," he said. "And I know what Clara Whittaker looked like, because she was a cousin of a woman who worked at the hotel. I thought I'd let you explain yourself in your own time." Georgia looked at him steadily. He looked back at her with the patient eyes of a man who had survived a great deal of unkindness from the world and had emerged from it without becoming unkind himself, which was an achievement she respected. "My name is Georgia Garner," she said, for the second time, and told him the relevant portion of the story, and when she finished, Darnell nodded once. "Elijah, no." "Yes." Darnell folded his hands on the table. "Then there's nothing more to know," he said, and got up and went back to his work, and that was that. Georgia sat with the ledgers for a while after he left and thought about the fact that she had now told her true story to 2 men, and both of them had responded with a kind of simple acceptance that she had not known to expect, and that was, she realized, making it harder and harder to keep the careful distance she had been keeping from the life she was building here. The distance collapsed entirely on a Tuesday evening in the first week of July. It had been a long day of unrelenting heat, the kind that Kansas summer could produce that was like standing inside a bread oven, and Georgia had been cooking and cleaning, and dealing with a visit from a woman in town named Mrs. Beaumont, who had come out on some pretext of returning a borrowed pot, but had really come, Georgia suspected, to assess the domestic situation at the Double W. Mrs. Beaumont had found everything in perfect order and Georgia's manners and presentation impeccable, and had been disappointed in a way she was too well-bred to show, and had taken her leave with elaborate courtesy, and Georgia had smiled through every second of it. By evening, Georgia was tired in a way that went past her bones and into something deeper, and she sat on the porch steps after supper, while Pete and Darnell were at the bunkhouse, and the stars were coming out across the Kansas sky in the extravagant way they had that still startled her. Thousands of them in a darkness that was truly dark rather than city dark. Elijah came and sat on the steps beside her. Not exactly beside her, there was a proper distance, but the steps were not wide and the proper distance was not very far. "Hard day," he said, not a question. "Mrs. Beaumont," Georgia said, which apparently conveyed everything necessary. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "She came out here twice last year to check on me," he said. "Told my neighbor Hartley's wife that the Double W was a bachelor's disaster and somebody ought to do something. She seemed very interested in whether anyone was doing something. And is someone," he said, and there was something in how he said it that was different from the general question it might have been. Georgia looked sideways at him. He was looking at the stars. The line of his profile in the dark was clean and serious, and she had looked at it too many times in daylight to be pretending she didn't know every detail of it. "I am trying," she said carefully, "to do the work I was hired to do and not complicate things." "What things?" "Things that are complicated enough." He was quiet for a moment. An owl called from the cottonwoods along the river, and the horses moved softly in the corral. "Georgia," he said, and the way he said her name, her real name, not the borrowed one, was enough to make her breath catch. "I want to ask you something direct, and I'd like a direct answer if that's all right." "I prefer direct things," she said. "Generally." He turned his head and looked at her, and in the starlight his face was open in a way she had not seen it before in daylight, some habitual restraint lowered. "Are you happy here?" It was not what she had expected him to ask. She had expected something about her intentions or her plans or how long she meant to stay. the practical questions that a reasonable employer would have every right to ask. But he had asked if she was happy, and the question went somewhere inside her and found something true before she could guard against it. "Yes," she said, "more than I have been in a long time, more than I expected to be anywhere." He held her gaze for a long moment and then looked back at the stars and said, very quietly, "Good." And that was all he said. But the silence that came after it was the warmest silence Georgia had ever sat inside, and she stayed on the steps until the moon came up over the eastern horizon and filled the prairie with silver light, and Elijah stayed beside her, and neither of them said anything more, and it was more than enough. The following week he rode with her to Abilene for supplies, just the two of them, Pete having sprained his wrist in a minor altercation with a fence post, and Darnell being occupied with the day's work. It was the first time Georgia had been back in town since she'd arrived, and she felt the town differently now, having the double W to come back to, having names to put to faces when she saw people Elijah knew. He introduced her to people they encountered in the general store and at the feed supply, and he introduced her as Georgia, which she noticed, and which she found herself holding onto through the whole morning as though it were something precious. They had lunch at the hotel dining room, and over beef stew and fresh bread Georgia told him about the ledger error she'd corrected and what it meant for the tax records, and he listened with focused attention and asked questions that showed he understood the implications exactly, and she felt the particular pleasure of having her competence taken seriously, which was not as common an experience in her life as she would have liked. He told her about his plans for expanding the herd next spring, about the water rights situation along the Smoky Hill that he'd been navigating for 2 years, about a possibility of a supply contract with the railroad that would change the economics of the operation significantly if it came through. He talked about it with the careful enthusiasm of a man who has learned to plan carefully, because the prairie does not accommodate wishful thinking, and Georgia found herself drawn into the details and the possibilities and offering observations about the financial planning that he received with the same respect he gave everything she said. The ride back in the afternoon was golden with late sun, and they talked about things with no practical application at all, books they had read, places they had imagined, the shapes of things they wanted their lives to have. It was, Georgia thought, the most expansive conversation she had ever had with a person she had known for such a short time, and also the most honest, because out here on the open road with nothing in any direction but grass and sky, there seemed no particular reason to be anything other than truthful. "I used to think I'd go to San Francisco eventually," she told him. "When I was planning a future from Ohio, it seemed like the farthest possible thing." "Do you still think that?" She considered the question. She looked at the road ahead and the way it curved slightly to follow the river, and then straightened out toward the place where the Double W's barn was just beginning to be visible in the distance. "No," she said. "I think I was trying to imagine somewhere far enough away from the things I wanted that I couldn't see myself being disappointed when I didn't get them. San Francisco is a good destination when you've given up on the things that are closer." What were the closer things? She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, handling the horses with the easy attention of long habit. His hands on the reins were steady and sure. "A house," she said, "a proper home, work that uses all the parts of me, not just the convenient ones, and somebody," she stopped, reconsidered, "somebody who actually looks at me when I speak." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said with careful precision, "I look at you when you speak." "Yes," Georgia said, "you do." They were quiet the rest of the way home, but it was a different kind of quiet from before, one that had something in it that was looking for its next word. It found it on a Saturday in late July, during the dance at Hector and Rosaria's place. Rosaria held a summer gathering every year, she had told Georgia, because the prairie would eat you if you let it, and the cure was music and company, and she was right. Half the county seemed to come, ranchers and hands and townspeople and farm families, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a harmonica, and the evening turned into exactly what Rosaria had promised. Georgia wore her better dress, the blue one she'd brought from St. Louis, and put her hair up properly. And when she came down the stairs and Elijah was in the front room waiting with his hat in his hand and his good shirt on, and he looked up and saw her, the expression that moved across his face was one she felt in the center of her chest. "You look beautiful," he said, simply, and without the manner of a man reciting a required compliment. He said it like a fact. Georgia had received compliments before. Most of them had felt like hands reaching for something. This one felt like recognition. "Thank you," she said, and meant it entirely. At the gathering, Georgia found herself among people who seemed to accept her without question or calculation. The easy acceptance of a community that was too busy surviving to have much energy left over for elaborate social suspicion. Rosaria introduced her to women who were glad to see another woman capable of conversation, and Georgia found herself laughing more than she had in years, genuinely laughing, at stories about the prairie and children, and the particular comedy of the domestic arrangements that resulted when you were trying to build a civilization on the open plains with whatever came to hand. And then the fiddle struck up a reel, and Elijah appeared at her elbow and said, "I am not much for dancing, but if you want to dance, I'll try." And the honesty of the offer, the willingness to make a fool of himself if she wanted him to, did something to her heart that all the graceful compliments in the world had never managed. She said, "I'll teach you," and took his hand, and they went out onto the flat section of Rosaria's yard where the grass had been worn smooth, and the lanterns were hung in the cottonwood branches, and Georgia showed him the steps of the reel, and he was not as bad at it as he'd implied, being the kind of man who learned physical things quickly from pure attention, and by the second tune, he had it well enough to actually dance rather than just execute steps. And by the third he was grinning in a way she had not seen on his face before, openly and without reservation, and she was grinning back, and the lantern light was gold on everything, and Rosaria watched from the edge of the yard with the expression of a woman whose assessment has been confirmed. Later in the evening, when the dancing had settled and people were sitting with plates of food and glasses of lemonade, Georgia found herself on a bench at the edge of the yard with Elijah beside her, closer than the porch steps had been, their shoulders almost touching in the warm night. "This is what the closer thing looks like," she said, not planning to say it, the words arriving from somewhere that had bypassed her caution. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and they were very close, and the lantern light made everything soft, and the music was still going somewhere behind them. "Yes," he said, "it is." And then he said more quietly, "I want to ask you something." "You said that before," she reminded him, "on the porch." "I asked the wrong question then. I was working up to this one." He looked at her steadily, and she could see that he was as serious as she had ever seen him, but not afraid. "I don't know yet what all of it looks like. I know I'm a cattle rancher in Kansas with more work than certainty, and that's probably not what you planned for when you were in Ohio or St. Louis. But I know that since you arrived here I have been thinking about you every single day, and I have been not saying so because I wasn't sure if you—" He stopped. "Are you staying?" Georgia looked at this man who had known her real name for weeks and kept it safe, who had said come in when she had arrived with a borrowed name and a carpetbag that belonged to someone else, who had left coffee on the stove and wrapped her cut hand and stood beside her in the storm, and she said, "Yes, Elijah, I'm staying." He exhaled, one long breath, like he had been holding something and had set it down. "Then I want to be very clear about what I'm asking," he said, "because I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. I'm not asking about the housekeeping. I know you're not. What I'm asking," he paused and then said it plainly, the way he said everything that mattered. "What I'm asking is whether you'll eventually let me give you my name, my actual name, so you don't have to borrow anyone else's again." The night seemed to go very quiet, the music and the voices receding to somewhere far away. Georgia looked at Elijah Whittaker and felt everything in her that had been braced for a long time understand that it could stop. "That is not a small thing to offer," she said. "No," he agreed, "it isn't. I came here carrying someone else's name because I had no good options left," she said, needing him to understand this, needing him to know the full truth of where she had been when she arrived. "I don't want you to give me yours out of pity for that." "I am not giving it to you out of pity," he said, and the evenness of his voice was absolutely certain. "I'm offering it because I would rather it belong to you than to anyone else." Georgia held that for a moment. She was a practical woman who believed in thinking things through. But there are moments when thinking things through is simply the long way around to something you already know, and this was one of those moments. "I would like that very much," she said. "Eventually." "Eventually," he agreed, and the word had a shape in his mouth that included every patient thing he was, and he took her hand where it rested on the bench beside her, and held it simply, and they sat in the lantern light and the warm July night, and Georgia thought that the farthest she had ever needed to go from Ohio was exactly here. What followed was a courtship conducted in the manner of the time and the place, which was to say openly, and with the knowledge of everyone around them. Since the prairie is not a private environment, and everyone at Hector and Rosaria's gathering had seen them on that bench, and the news had traveled with the efficiency that small communities manage. Pete was delighted in his uncomplicated way, and told Georgia she was the best thing that had happened to the Double W since Elijah had built the second barn, which she chose to take as a compliment. Rosaria came to call the following week and brought empanadas, and stayed for 2 hours talking about the practical aspects of ranch life from a woman's perspective, with a frankness that Georgia found more useful than any etiquette manual. Darnell said nothing at all, but began doing small, unnecessary things like splitting extra firewood and leaving it stacked near the kitchen door, which was his way. Elijah courted her the way he did everything, with directness and genuine attention and no excessive ornamentation. He brought her things he noticed she needed before she asked: a better lamp for the desk where she worked on the accounts, a book from Abilene that he'd seen mentioned in a newspaper and thought she'd like, a bunch of prairie wildflowers that he left on the porch railing one morning without comment, which she put in a tin can in the kitchen window where she could see them all day. He made time that was not ranch time, real time, deliberate and unhurried, evenings on the porch where they talked about everything and nothing, Sunday afternoons where they rode out across the prairie together, and she learned the land the way she was learning him, with attention and growing love. She kissed him first, which she was fairly sure he had expected. They were on the porch in late August, and the evening was warm and the stars were all out, and he had been reading to her from the book he'd brought, a novel, and she had been watching his face more than listening to the words, and when he looked up and saw her watching he had smiled in that new way, the way she hadn't seen before July, open and a little unguarded, and she had leaned across and kissed him, briefly and with great intention. And when she sat back, he had that expression that she would later think of as her favorite thing in the world, the expression of a man who has received exactly what he hoped for and is too moved to immediately speak. He said, "Georgia," just her name, the real one. "Elijah," she said back in the same tone, and he laughed and she laughed, and then he kissed her back in a way that was less brief and equally intentional, and the night went on around them generous and warm, and the prairie was enormous in every direction. And Georgia Garner, who had arrived at this ranch with a dead woman's name and no particular hope, found herself understanding for the first time what hope actually felt like when it had weight. The trouble came in September, because the plains always reserve something for September when you've gotten comfortable. A man arrived at the Double W on a Monday morning when Elijah was out checking the north fence line with Pete, and Georgia was alone in the house. The man was not from Abilene. He was from St. Louis. She knew it from the cut of his coat and the way he looked at the ranch house with calculation rather than the honest curiosity of a neighbor or traveler. He knocked at the front door and Georgia opened it, and they looked at each other and she recognized him. His name was Aldous, and he had worked for Forrest Crane, not the men who had come to her room that night but a different category, the kind who did the quieter work of tracking and information. She said with absolute steadiness, "Can I help you?" Aldous had the decency, or perhaps the professional habit, of appearing normal. "I'm looking for a woman named Georgia Garner, or possibly calling herself Clara Whittaker. I was told she might be in this area." "I don't know any Clara Whittaker," Georgia said, which was true enough. Aldous looked at her the way a man looks when he knows he's looking at what he's looking for. "I think you might be Georgia Garner," he said. "I think," Georgia said, "that you're trespassing on private property, and the owner will be back shortly, and he will not be pleased to find an uninvited stranger on his porch." There was a beat of silence. Aldous looked past her into the house, calculating something. Georgia stood in the doorway and did not step back, and kept her expression neutral by the same mechanism that had gotten her through 2 years in St. Louis, which was the knowledge that fear feeds certain kinds of men, and she would not be feeding this one. "Mr. Crane is interested in finding her," Aldous said. "He's willing to be reasonable." "Mr. Crane's interests are no concern of mine," Georgia said. "Good day." She closed the door and bolted it, and stood in the hallway with her back against the wood and breathed, slowly and carefully, until she heard the sound of a horse moving away from the house. When Elijah came in at noon, she told him all of it, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood in front of her, making herself stay still while she told it. He listened without interruption, and when she finished there was a silence in which she saw something move across his face that was not the measured calm she was used to seeing there. It was not anger exactly. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger, something that had decided something. "He'll come back," Elijah said. "Yes, or Crane will send someone else. Then we need to deal with it properly." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Marshal Teague. He came looking for you because of Crane, which tells me Crane has reached out to law enforcement somehow. But Teague is a fair man, I know him. If we go to him with the full story, with what Crane actually did in St. Louis and why you left, he won't hand you back to a man who was threatening you." "You want me to go to the marshal?" "I want to go with you to the marshal," he corrected. "It's different." Georgia looked at him. He was looking at her with that steady and complete attention that she had learned was not just a manner. It was the actual orientation of his whole character toward the things that mattered to him. She was one of those things. She understood that now entirely. "All right," she said. They rode to Abilene the next morning, and Elijah sat with her in Marshal Teague's office while she told her story for the 3rd time, the most complete version yet. And Georgia had a lawyer's instinct for what details mattered and laid them out clearly. The name of the boarding house and the specific nature of Crane's operation, and what his men had done, and when, and the names of 2 women still in St. Louis who had witnessed parts of it. Marshal Teague was a gruff man in his 50s who chewed a toothpick throughout and whose expression gave nothing away, and at the end he was quiet for a long time. "Forrest Crane's been under inquiry from the St. Louis authorities for 6 months, Teague said finally, "mostly about his saloon operations. If what you're saying about his treatment of the women at his boarding house can be substantiated, it adds to that inquiry considerably." "I can write down every detail," Georgia said. "I have a very good memory." Teague looked at Elijah. "She's staying at the W. "She is," Elijah said with a tone that was civil and entirely immovable. Teague looked back at Georgia. "I'll send a wire to St. Louis today. In the meantime, if that man Aldous comes back to your property, you have every right to have him removed. I'll put that in writing." He did, and they rode back to the W with the paper in George's pocket, and the problem not fully resolved but changed in character. No longer something creeping after her in the dark, but something out in the daylight where it had to be dealt with properly. Forrest Crane's reach, it turned out, was not as long as he had believed. The combination of Georgia's detailed testimony, which Teague wired in full to the St. Louis authorities, and 2 of the women Georgia had named who came forward of their own accord once the inquiry had official momentum, resulted in Crane being arrested before October. Aldous did not return to the W. The thing that had been hanging over Georgia's head since St. Louis lifted itself and went away, and the autumn air in Kansas smelled particularly clean after it. The proposal, when it came formally, came in October, in the kitchen garden that had produced through the summer more abundantly than even Georgia's optimistic planning had anticipated. She was putting the garden to bed for winter, cutting back the spent plants and turning the soil, and Elijah came and crouched at the edge of the garden bed and watched her work for a moment, and then said, "The railroad supply contract came through." Georgia sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was trying to keep his expression neutral and not quite succeeding, a brightness underneath the composure. "Elijah, that's wonderful news. It means the double W will be." He paused and she could see him arranging words. "It means this place will be what I was trying to build it into, a proper operation, solid, the kind of thing that could." He stopped again, looked at her directly, "that a family could build on." Georgia set down her garden fork. "Georgia Garner," he said, and he reached into his shirt pocket and brought out a ring, a plain gold band that caught the October light with a simplicity and sincerity that was so entirely him that she felt it in her throat. "I bought this 3 weeks ago, and I've been waiting for what felt like the right moment, and I have realized I am going to wait forever if I don't just ask you now. Will you marry me?" Georgia looked at the ring, and at the man holding it, the man who had taken her in when she had arrived under a false name, who had kept her secret and her truth both, who had offered her his name when what she needed most was to have a name that was actually hers. She thought of Cincinnati and St. Louis and the stagecoach and the borrowed letter and how many things had to go a particular way to bring her to this garden in October in Kansas, and she thought that if she was honest, which she intended always to be, she would not have changed any of it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Elijah, absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger with the careful hands of a man who was handling something that mattered enormously. And then he was standing, and she was standing, and his arms were around her, and her face was against his shoulder, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart, which was beating slightly faster than its usual measured pace, and she found that deeply reassuring and also deeply delightful. They were married in December in the Abilene church, on a cold blue-sky day when the prairie was pale with frost and the cottonwood branches were bare and beautiful against the sky. Rosaria cried, which she had told Georgia she intended to do and was not apologizing for. Pete wore his best shirt and a cravat he'd borrowed from somewhere that didn't entirely match, and Darnell stood in the front row with the upright dignity of a man, attending something he was glad to witness. Hector gave Georgia away, because she had no family near enough to come, and he did it with a gravity that told her he understood the weight of the honor. Elijah wore a suit that fit him properly and looked at Georgia when she came down the aisle with an expression she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. The expression of a man who has found exactly the person he was hoping for and knows the full value of what he has found. The minister said the words, and they said their words back. And when he said that Elijah could kiss his bride, Elijah did. And the small congregation applauded with a warmth that filled the cold church, and Georgia Garner, who had arrived in Kansas with someone else's name, became Georgia Whittaker, and the name settled on her like something that had always been waiting to fit. The reception was at the Double W, because Rosaria organized it that way, and the house was full of people and food and noise in a way that Georgia had not experienced since she was a girl in her father's house. And she moved through it with Elijah's hand, sometimes at the small of her back and sometimes holding hers. And she thought that belonging somewhere felt like this, like noise and warmth and the specific gravity of a place that is yours. The winter of 1873 into 1874 was a good one at the Double W, which is to say it was a hard one in the way that Kansas winters are hard, with cold and wind, and the daily labor of keeping animals alive and warm, but good in the way that hard things can be good when you are doing them with the right person. Georgia learned the full range of ranch life in winter, the way the work shifted from the outdoor urgency of the warmer months to a different kind of urgency, the maintenance of things, the preparation for the return of spring. She learned to do things she had never imagined doing in Cincinnati, to check on livestock in temperatures that froze the moisture in the air, to manage the wood supply and the food stores with the precision of an arithmetician, because the margin for error in a Kansas winter was slender. She and Elijah worked together with the easy efficiency of people who had learned each other's rhythms before they had to rely on them. And there was something in that reliance that was more intimate than the courtship had been. The knowledge of being actually trusted with someone's life and livelihood rather than just appreciated. They read to each other in the evenings, taking turns with books that Elijah ordered from Abilene or that came in the occasional supply from the east. They played cards with Pete when the bunkhouse got too cold and Pete came to sit by the kitchen fire. They argued occasionally, the way two people with opinions argue, and they were good at it, direct and honest, and neither one of them inclined to perform either submission or dominance. And they resolved things the way they resolved everything else, by talking plainly until they understood each other, which took as long as it took and no longer. In February, Georgia realized she was pregnant. She told Elijah on a Sunday morning, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the winter light coming thin and pale through the east window, and his face went through several things in rapid succession. A flash of something that might have been alarm immediately swallowed by something else that was clearly larger and that she watched settle into a steadiness and a happiness that he didn't try to contain. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "Very well. I'm perhaps 3 months along." She had been counting back carefully, as was her practical habit. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair the way he always did when he wanted to be at her level, which was one of the things she loved about him, and took her hands in his. "How are you feeling about it?" "I am feeling about it," she said, like a woman who came to Kansas with very little and is somehow finding herself with very much. He said nothing. He pressed his lips to her hands and stayed there for a moment, and when he looked up his eyes were bright in a way she had only seen once or twice, and she reached out and put her palm against his cheek, and he turned his face into her hand like a man leaning into sunlight. "We'll need to write to the Abilene doctor," he said, after a moment, the practical part of his mind reasserting itself. "I've already written," she said. He laughed. Of course she had. The spring of 1874 came in warm and full of promise, the double W expanding in several directions at once. The railroad supply contract brought in new capital, and Elijah put it to work carefully, enlarging the herd and repairing the south fence, and adding a room to the house that Georgia had pointed out would be needed before autumn. Pete hired on a second permanent hand, a young man named Carlos who was quiet and competent, and who regarded Georgia with the particular respectful shyness of someone who has been told she is excellent and is verifying this for himself. Rosaria came out on Thursdays now, regularly, ostensibly to help with the garden preparation, but actually Georgia understood because they had become genuine friends, the kind of friendship that only the prairie produces in the way it does, close and practical and without pretension, because pretension requires the energy of people who are not otherwise occupied keeping themselves alive. Hector and Elijah worked out a water rights agreement in April that settled a dispute that had apparently been simmering for 3 years, and celebrated by doing nothing more elaborate than shaking hands, but the relief in both their faces was considerable. Georgia kept the accounts with the precision she had established from the beginning, and the Double W's records were the best organized in the county, which she knew because Marshal Teague mentioned it once when he came out for a visit and asked to look at the cattle documentation for a legal matter, and Teague was not a man who gave compliments carelessly. She wrote to her brother in Cincinnati, Edmund, who was a printer like their father had been, and who had written to the St. Louis address and found her gone, and had not known where she was for nearly a year. He wrote back a long, relieved letter that made Georgia sit at the kitchen table and weep briefly, and with great satisfaction, and Elijah came in and found her and held her for a while without needing to know everything before he did it. On a September morning in 1874, With the prairie golden in all directions and the air cool enough to be crisp and warm enough to be kind, Georgia gave birth to a boy. It was a long labor and a hard one, attended by the Abilene doctor and Rosaria, who was magnificent in the manner of a woman who had done this 4 times herself and had strong opinions about how it should be managed. Elijah sat outside the bedroom door for 10 hours with the expression of a man undergoing something that had no practical remedy and was finding this profoundly difficult. When Rosaria opened the door and said, "Come in, Elijah, and meet your son," his face did the thing it had done at the kitchen table in February, the rapid sequence, and then the settling, but larger this time and more complex. And he came and sat on the edge of the bed beside Georgia, and she put the baby into his arms and watched him hold this small person with the extraordinary careful competence of someone who has never held an infant before but will not be dropping this one under any circumstances whatsoever. "He's all right," Elijah said, looking at Georgia. "He's perfect," she said. She was exhausted in a way that went past any ordinary exhaustion, and she was the happiest she had ever been in her life. The baby had dark hair and brown eyes and the most serious expression she had ever seen on a face that was less than an hour old. "Robert," Elijah said. Georgia had suggested it, her father's name. He had agreed immediately, with a quiet that said it meant something to him that she had chosen a family name to give to the child. "Robert Elijah Whittaker," Georgia said. Rosaria wiped her eyes and pretended she was not doing so, and left them. And Elijah sat with Georgia and their son in the September light, and the house was very quiet and very full. Robert grew the way prairie children grow, fast and brown, and with curiosity that outpaced caution, and the double W arranged itself around him the way places do, when a child is suddenly their center of gravity. Pete was devoted in the straightforward way that young men are when presented with a child who will eventually worship them. And Carlos taught Robert Spanish words that he repeated indiscriminately and without context, to Georgia's great amusement and Elijah's barely concealed delight. By the time Robert was 2 and steady on his feet, Georgia was expecting again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, or at least she was better at it, knowing the shape of the thing. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1877, a girl with Georgia's coloring and Elijah's expression, which was a combination that promised considerable personality, and they named her Margaret, for Rosaria's mother who had died the previous year, a tribute that made Rosaria cry so freely, and for so long that Hector had to bring her a second handkerchief. The Double W by 1877 was a different operation from the one Georgia had arrived at in 1873, though it was the same land and the same man at its center. The railroad contract had expanded, and Elijah's careful management had grown the herd to a size that required proper organization and proper records, and Georgia managed the business side with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything, and the two of them together were a more effective operation than either had been separately, which both of them knew and neither found it necessary to announce. Edmund came from Cincinnati in 1878, which was the visit Georgia had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure, because she had not seen her brother in 6 years, and she was no longer the woman he'd last known, and she was not entirely certain he would recognize the life she had built as what it was. He arrived in Abilene on the stage, which Georgia and Elijah met together, and when he stepped off the stage, Edmund Garner was a lean man in his early 30s with their father's eyes and the printer's ink permanently under his nails, and the expression of a man who is not certain what he is arriving at. He looked at Georgia, and then he looked at Elijah beside her, and then he looked at the wagon where Robert was sitting between the bench and the bed making the most of the freedom, and something in Edmund's expression shifted from uncertain to something considerably warmer. "You look well," he said to Georgia. "You look different." "I am different," she said, "in ways that are mostly improvements." Elijah shook Edmund's hand with the honest directness that was his way with everyone new, and Edmund responded to it the way most people did, with an immediate relaxation of some reserve he'd been carrying. They rode out to the Double W, and Edmund sat on the porch in the evening with Elijah, and they talked about things that Georgia listened to from the kitchen window while she put Robert to bed. And what she heard was two men finding their way to understanding each other without requiring her to mediate, which was exactly what she had hoped for. Edmund stayed for 3 weeks and left with a commission from Elijah to find and ship a printing press from Cincinnati, a small one, because Georgia had said, in a private conversation about the future of the county and the lack of reliable local information, that she thought a newspaper would not go amiss. And Elijah had agreed with the immediate assent of a man who has been waiting for the person beside him to name the thing they both see. The Smoky Hill Record began publication in January of 1879, printed on the press Edmund had sent and edited by Georgia Whittaker, whose name appeared at the top of the first edition in type she had set herself, remembering everything her father had taught her on the floor of his Cincinnati shop. It was a modest paper, 4 pages, weekly, covering the affairs of the county with the honest precision and lack of sensationalism that Georgia had decided would be its character from the beginning. It was received with a surprise that quickly converted to appreciation, because people on the plains are practical, and a paper that tells them what they need to know without elaborate embellishment is a useful thing. Georgia received letters, more than she expected, from women across the county who told her it mattered to see a woman's name at the head of something serious, and she replied to every one of them. Elijah read each issue when it came off the press and had opinions about it that he expressed directly and Georgia received directly, and they argued about editorial decisions the way they argued about everything, with honesty and without damage, and the paper improved from each conversation. Robert started at the Abilene School in the fall of 1879, taking the buggy in with Pete on the days Pete made the supply run. He was 5 years old and opinionated and read better than most children twice his age, because Georgia had taught him with the same method her father had used, reading out loud from everything available, and he had his father's memory for detail, and his mother's refusal to accept incomplete information. Margaret was 2 and luminously herself, with dark curling hair and the habit of doing everything at full intensity, including sleeping, which she did with the conviction of someone making a point. Elijah was helpless in the face of her, in a way that Georgia found endearing and also occasionally useful. The years from 1879 to 1883 were years of building, in every sense the word could mean. The Double W grew into one of the sound operations in its part of Kansas, not the largest but widely considered one of the best managed, and Elijah's reputation in the cattle industry was that of a man whose word was reliable and whose operation was honest, which in the cattle market of Kansas in the 1880s was not a universal condition and was consequently valued. Georgia's newspaper became a genuine institution of the county, growing to 8 pages and then 12, and taking on a second compositor by 1882, a young woman named Alice who had come from Missouri and who had the same hunger for useful work that Georgia had brought to Kansas 9 years earlier. Georgia trained her with the same fullness of information that her father had given her, without the reservation that some people feel about teaching their skills to those who might eventually surpass them. Pete married in 1881, a woman named Juanita from Hector and Rosaria's extended family, and built a house a mile from the Double W, and continued to work the cattle with the loyalty and energy he'd always had, and the additional motivation of someone to come home to. Carlos married the following year and stayed on as well, and the community around the Double W had the warm cohesion of people who had chosen to be there, and continued to make that choice every day. Darnell retired from day work in 1882, his joints no longer willing to sustain the demands of cattle work, and Elijah gave him a section of land along the river that Darnell had always had an eye for, a piece of ground with good water and a southern exposure, and Darnell built himself a house there and kept a garden that was the envy of everyone who saw it. He came to Sunday suppers at the Double W with regularity, and he and Georgia still had conversations over the kitchen table that had the character of two people who understood the true shape of things and didn't need to explain themselves to each other. Robert at 9 was already spending his Saturdays with his father on the ranch, learning the cattle and the land with the focused seriousness that he brought to everything. He had decided he would run the Double W eventually, and was approaching this ambition with methodical preparation that made both his parents simultaneously proud and slightly alarmed, because he was 9. Margaret at 7 had decided she wanted to write for the newspaper, and Georgia had given her a small section of the back page to report on the doings of the county's children, which Margaret treated as a sacred responsibility. In the fall of 1883, on an October evening 10 years after Georgia had first stepped off the stagecoach in Abilene, she and Elijah sat on the porch in the evening light the way they still did, the way they always did when the day permitted it. And the prairie was the autumn gold that never failed to move her, and Robert and Margaret were inside doing the homework that was not being done with sufficient attention to judge by the voices. And the Double W was settled around them like a body that is comfortable in itself. 10 years ago today, Georgia said. Elijah looked at her with the same eyes she had looked into across that wagon bench in 1873, dark and steady and entirely present. He had more silver at his temples now, and the lines of the Kansas sun were deeper in his face, and she loved every single one of them. "I remember meeting the stage," he said. "You looked at me like you were already deciding something." "I was," he said. "What were you deciding?" He considered this the way he considered things that deserved real thought, whether you were the kind of person who would stay. "And what did you decide?" "That I didn't know yet," he said, "but that I wanted to find out." Georgia looked out at the prairie where the last light was making everything amber and particular, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with a borrowed name and a carpetbag in fear she was refusing to acknowledge, and she thought about how that woman had become this one, the one sitting on this porch with this man, in this life that was so completely hers that she could feel it in her bones. "Elijah," she said. "Yes. I want you to know something." She turned to look at him. "I came here with nothing I could honestly claim as my own, and you gave me the first real things I ever had. Not just the name, though the name mattered more than you probably knew. But this." She gestured at the ranch, the prairie, the house with the noise of children inside it, all of this. "You gave it to me by deciding to trust me before you had any real reason to. You gave it back tenfold," he said. "I intend to keep doing that," she said, "for as long as there is." He took her hand, the same hand he had wrapped 10 years ago with a strip of clean cloth on an ordinary afternoon, and held it the way he held everything that mattered, with care and certainty, and without the slightest intention of letting go. They sat together in the October evening, until the light went golden and then rose-colored, and then the first stars appeared above the eastern horizon. And inside the house Margaret called for help with arithmetic, and Robert told her loudly that he could help, and Margaret said just as loudly that she did not want his help, and Elijah and Georgia looked at each other with the shared knowledge of parents who are suppressing amusement, and stood together and went inside. The kitchen was warm and lit and full, and Georgia moved through it to the table where the children were, and Elijah put more wood in the stove, and Pete's lamp was visible through the window where his house sat warm in the dark. And the Double W settled into its evening, the way it settled into every evening, around the people who belonged to it and to each other. Georgia Whittaker, who had arrived in Kansas in the spring of 1873 with a borrowed name and no particular future, set the lamp on the table and helped her daughter with the arithmetic, and listened to her son explain why his version of the problem was correct, and understood in the complete and ordinary way of people who have found what they were looking for without knowing they were looking for it, that she was exactly where she was meant to be, in a life that was entirely and honestly her own, under a name that had been freely given and was held with both hands. Outside, the prairie went on in every direction for as far as anyone could see, enormous and patient and full of whatever came next, and the light burned warm in the windows of the Double W, and the smoke rose from the chimney into the October dark, and the stars came out one by one over Kansas in their ancient and indifferent beauty, and none of it knew or cared about the particular happiness inside that house, but it surrounded it anyway, the way the plains surround everything. Endlessly and without condition,